Welcome to our 8th class on Jesus and his parables. Today we will look at the parable of the dishonest steward, a parable that may be one of the more difficult of Jesus' parables to understand. In order to appreciate what Jesus is teaching, we need to look at several of the cultural nuances surrounding Jesus' story. The setting of the parable is a large estate whose owner employed a manager to run the business and deal with the tenants. In our translation from Dr. Ken Bailey, the owner is referred to as the rich man or the master. The rich man was a man of moral character who was well respected in the community. He cared enough about his estate that when he discovered his manager was wasteful, fired him. The debtors were likely small farmers who rented the land from the owner and paid their rent in crops they harvested from the land each year. The steward would be paid a salary by the owner as well as a fee he charged each renter. The steward was no doubt padding this handling fee and didn't record these under-the-table payments in the books he kept for the owner. Now, we must understand this additional fee paid to a farm manager was considered a normal part of doing business, as long as the extra fee wasn't excessive. In fact, it was considered legitimate and even respectable in this culture. The last tidbit to remember is the community is a character in this parable as well. The Middle Eastern thinks it acts as part of a community rather than as an isolated individual, as we do here in the West. As the parable opens, the involvement of the community is implied when we are informed that charges were brought to the owner. We don't know who brought these accusations, but it means a wider circle of people beyond the owner, his steward, and the renters were involved. The actions of the steward were known by at least a few others in the community and not completely hidden. So, let's turn to the parable. I'd encourage you to download the handout of the text found on the class website and follow along. Our principal audience is Jesus' disciples, though we will discover later in Luke chapter 18, the Pharisees were also listening to Jesus' story. Allegations the steward was squandering his wealth reached the owner of the estate. The master sends for his steward and asks a question. A literal translation of this question is, "What this I hear about you," without the word is. This is a very forceful phrase in Middle Eastern culture, often used in this type of situation. It implies that the master had been hearing a steady stream of accusations about the shady behavior of the steward for quite some time. When a servant heard a question phrased this way, they weren't sure of what their boss actually knew and could be frightened into divulging additional information. But the steward is smart and doesn't respond to the question. His silence in front of his boss is very significant in the Middle Eastern context. Jesus' audience would expect the man to vehemently defend himself. The master finally breaks the steward's silence with the ultimatum, "Give me an accounting of your management." Two questions spring to mind at this point. First, is the steward fired immediately or sometime later? Second, is he expected to surrender the account books or to get the accounts in order? The first question seems to have an obvious answer. The verb the owner uses is in the present tense, meaning the steward is fired on the spot. This is the norm in the Middle Eastern villages, even today, as well as throughout the business world. If you find an employee embezzling funds, you don't give them a 2 weeks notice. They may continue to steal from the company. The steward has been fired, so his legal authority is immediately canceled. Here's a cultural nuance we need to understand. In Middle Eastern culture, when the steward is told to turn in the books, he's expected to argue with his boss and protest his innocence. He would try to defend himself or blame someone else or even insinuate his boss was at fault. But the steward says nothing in his defense. His silence speaks volumes. He's essentially saying, "I'm guilty, and my boss knows I'm guilty. My boss expected compliance with his wishes, and my disobedience brought judgment on me. And there's no way I can argue my way back into my job." Now understand that the rich man was within his rights to take the steward to court and have him jailed. But the master didn't even scold his steward, which Jesus' disciples would have found shocking. The master, who demanded obedience, showed unusual mercy and kindness to his disobedient steward. So the steward turns all his energy to securing his future. The steward chooses to interpret his situation a little differently from the way his boss does. He chooses to think he was not fired on the spot and has a little cushion of time to settle the accounts and not turn the books over immediately. The steward makes an honest assessment of his affairs. He needs a roof over his head and food on the table. He needs another job. Surprisingly, he considers manual labor. Any other educated man who held a position of authority would reject this option because it's beneath his dignity. But this man decides against digging or farming because he's not strong enough to do this kind of work. Begging in the ancient Near East was considered a legitimate way to care for yourself, but it was a despised activity. The steward rejects begging as an option because he doesn't want to be humiliated by the whole community. Add to the fact that his job search is extra tricky because he's been fired for squandering his boss's wealth. Who will hire him with that on his resume? He needs to spin the situation to change his public image. The steward devises a scheme to turn his circumstances around. He knows he must move quickly because although word hasn't gotten out yet that he's been fired, he doesn't have much time before the whole village knows, and he has to hand over the books and pack up his office. And he must implement his plan before his former boss finds out what he's doing. The steward's goal is to do a favor for the renters and thus place them under obligation to return the favor when he needs it. The steward's plan is simple. Offer the same kind of mercy to the debtors that he received from his master. If his plan works, he's the hero in the community. If it doesn't, he'll be headed to prison. The text tells us the steward summoned the renters, something he no doubt did multiple times in the past when he delivered a message from the rich man. The renters don't know the situation has changed, so they answered the summons expecting to hear something important. Note, the steward calls each renter in separately so they don't start chatting amongst themselves. When the renters arrive, the steward is in a great hurry, so much so that he doesn't even call them by name or title. In fact, he's bordering on rude. The steward asks each man what he owes, then tells them to reduce the amount of their bill. Interestingly, the worth of 50 measures of oil and 80 measures of wheat are roughly equivalent to 500 denarii. It's a lot easier to just subtract 500 from the total amount of each bill than to calculate a comparable percentage for each commodity. Now, you would think that the renters might be a little wary of what's going on, but they still believe the steward is employed and has the authority to change their bills, especially since the steward says, "my master," as if he still has his job. They also assume the steward was on their side and talked his master into decreasing their bills. Now, if the renters had had any inkling that things weren't above board, they would not have gone along with the scheme, because they would not want to break faith with the master. He would refuse to rent to them in the future. The renters are portrayed as upright men in the community and not accomplices to a crime. Of course, the steward takes credit for the decrease in each man's bill. The reductions were completely unexpected, and we can imagine how the steward quietly let it slip that he talked his boss into it. It's as though the steward helped convince his master to offer a Christmas bonus to everyone. The money actually came from the rich man, but the steward would get the credit for convincing him to be generous to his renters. After meeting with the tenants, the dishonest steward gathers up the altered bills and delivers them to his master. Can you imagine the rich man's face when it dawns on him what has happened? The whole village is celebrating his generosity and praising his name for decreasing their bills. Now, he has two options. One option is to go to the villagers and tell them it's all been a big mistake, the steward was fired and didn't have authorization to decrease their bills. If he did that, he'd get his money back, but the villagers would be angry and curse him for being stingy. He'd lose face in the community. Second option is to protect his honor and accept the accolades the village is heaping on him while allowing the steward to get away with fraud. The master chooses option 2. The master turns to the disgraced steward and praises him for his cleverness in getting out of a seemingly hopeless situation. The master is a generous man at heart. We already saw this in how he treated his steward earlier when he didn't immediately throw him in jail. In the Middle East, a key characteristic of a noble man is generosity, and leaders in the community are expected to be kind and gracious to everyone. Those of us who live in the West are often troubled when we hear this parable because Jesus used a dishonest man as the hero of the story. This doesn't bother people in the Middle East. If you're a peasant at the bottom of the economic ladder, you love it when a David defeats a Goliath by beating them at their own game. We must recognize that Jesus is using a rabbinic principle of from the light to the heavy. If a man solved this problem by relying on the mercy of an imperfect human, how much more can we rely on the mercy of our perfect, loving Father when we are in crisis? For us today, the message of the parable is both simple and profound. God is a God of judgment and mercy. We humans have a serious problem. It's called sin. We can make all the excuses we want to, but the reality is judgment awaits us. But if we are wise, we will place our trust in God's mercy and live into His forgiveness. To summarize this parable, the parable is directed at Jesus' disciples while the Pharisees listened in. The master demanded obedience, yet showed unusual mercy toward his dishonest steward. This dishonest steward, who received mercy, devised a scheme that imitated his master's mercy. If a fallible human offers mercy in times of crisis, how much more will our Heavenly Father offer us mercy in the crisis, which is our sin? A wise person places their trust in God's mercy, for God loves us. Thanks for joining us. Next week, we will look at the parable of the judge and the widow. Please read Luke chapter 18, verses 1 to 8 to prepare. Until then, keep the faith.